Well, welcome back. We're ready to announce our next speaker for the afternoon. It's Dr. Robert M. Wood. Bob and I have known each other for actually we've lived next to each other for 30 years, but we didn't know each other until we met at the MUFON Orange County. We both got on the board together, and so I've now known him for 23 years, but he literally lived 5 houses away from me, and I didn't even know it. So delighted to be able to introduce him. Bob holds his Bachelor of Science degree in Aeronautical Engineering from the University of Colorado and his PhD in Physics from Cornell University. He led a distinguished 43-year career being employed with General Electric's Aeronautics and Ordnance Laboratory, then the Douglas Aircraft Company, which became McDonnell Douglas and then became Boeing. Some of the most significant projects he's worked on, or more interesting projects, include the Nike Zeus missile. Some of you remember that. Also, radar discrimination of reentry vehicles, which means when they launched the ICBMs to us with nuclear weapons on them, they put 10 dummy warheads in there, and the radar's got to pick out which is the real weapon and which is the dummies. And he was able to work on that. He also headed up the McDonnell Douglas Independent Research and Development projects for new applications, including advanced technology used on the International Space Station, and did a number of proposals with his team on satellite launch vehicles. He's been a MUFON board member for 24 years and has published with his son Ryan on the internet leaked documents on UFOs and a book with Nick Redfern called Alien Viruses, Crashed UFOs, MJ-12, and Biowarfare. This afternoon, he'll be addressing a couple topics. One is document authentication on some recently released documents, as well as the threat of alien viruses. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Robert Wood.
Thank you, Jan. Alien Viruses and Leaked Documents is the new title. It's a little different from what you see in the proceedings, but I will be talking about those two things this afternoon. And before I begin, however, I want to establish my credibility by showing you some photographs of what Jan just said I did in my career. I helped put Teflon on the Nike Zeus missile in the 1940s. I helped the independent research and development people get good scores and therefore lots of money for our company, the Douglas Aircraft and McDonnell Douglas. And I helped develop the algorithms to tell the difference between decoys and reentry vehicles from the Soviet Union with this phased array radar system that General Electric designed. And finally, I wound up talking about how you'd make the space station cheaper, sooner, and better using advanced technology. During that time in the late 60s, as a result of a coincidence, I got asked by my management to do a little project on figuring out how the UFOs work. So at the time that Condon was doing the Colorado report, we were doing a study for $500,000 to try to figure out how the UFOs work. The only thing is we didn't have a UFO. But we did the best we could. We did stuff in a laboratory, we spun magnets, we set up a vehicle that could instrument strange lights in the mountain. But one thing was sure, after a year and a half, we knew exactly how much money we were spending, but we had no idea how close we were to getting the answer. So I went on to do these other things until 1993, at which time I retired. And then one of the guys that I'd hired for this program, Stan Friedman, called me on the phone and he said, you know, Bob, he says, I've got a document that is kind of interesting. It's called Extraterrestrial Entities in Technology, Recovery and Disposal. And here is a picture of that document. He said, do you think that you'd like to try to authenticate it? And I said, sure, that sounds like fun. So if we could put that document up on the screen, I want to point out a couple things. There we go. That it says at the top, it says restricted with, trying to get my light here working. Yeah, can you see that? No, oh yeah, just better. Well, anyway, At the top it says restricted with top secret. It's scarce, but samples exist. The War Office logo at the bottom was used as late as 1969. The footnote imprint and identifies the MJ12 as customer, and the TO numbers are consistent with the policy of that time. That's the numbers up the top there. So anyway, I presented this at a UFO meeting in the late 90s, and Linda Moulton Howe was there and said, it's the first time we've seen anything with real data to convince me that it's authentic. And so as a result of that, I got a lot of publicity, and Tim Cooper started sending me documents because I was the document guy. And so as a result of that, we got quite a few. And here there are the 103 different documents I got over those 10 years or so. That included some top secret ones. There's two of them that are in red. The one that shows Bill Moore is 1985, when he got these 11 pages of the Aquarius document we'll talk about later. And the other one is the Quillen from Don Berliner. That's the Psalm 101, the one that we just saw. So before I get into alien viruses, I want to say a little bit about how you authenticate documents. First is physical and the intellectual. And physically, what you do is you date the ink, the watermark, the paper, you identify the typewriter make, and compare signatures. Intellectually, what you do is you hunt for anachronisms, things that don't quite fit. You can use etymology, the study of language, to compare words changing, and you compare with known authentic documents. So we did all those kind of things. I'll give you some examples of that. Example of matching the type font. Here, for the Special Operations Manual especially, the expert that I talked to said, well, you know, I looked at this document, and he said, I'd say it's a hoax based on content, but he said the fact that the Z is raised tells me that it's authentic. And the reason I know that is because in those days, which is 1954, we were using a hot lead printing press, and there'd be a little crud on the bottom of rarely used letters, like the Z, and they wouldn't fall down and seat properly. And so that's why he said, I know that it was authentically printed in 1954, either in this building, which was the public printing office, or in the basement of the Pentagon. And another example, in etymology, words change. In 1954, first aid had initial caps, and now it doesn't. Screwdriver was two separate words, and now it's just one word. So these are little things that kind of confirmed the timing of the printing of this document. Some people say that because you find a signature that is on a question document that's identical to a signature on an established document, that it must be a hoax. But it's possible, however, that Truman, in this case, Truman is the example signature, could have been signing 5 documents at once. And if he had this unit, the pentagraph, he would have loved to use it when he wanted to deceive people. And bear in mind that Truman had access to a lot of important stuff, beginning, of course, with the atomic weaponry. All right, now, with that background, I want to talk about alien viruses. When I first became sort of pseudo-famous, my son, Ryan Wood, got involved. Actually, I think he met Alan Hynek when he came for dinner when he was 14 years old. So Ryan was interested in following up on the Special Operations Manual, and in 2002, I think, he decided that he would run a crash retrieval conference in Las Vegas, and he promised that he would do 10 of those. He did 7 crash retrieval conferences, and each year I was asked to make a presentation, of course. And I'd already talked about the things that I had studied already, but the subject of alien viruses came up. So I talked to Nick Redfern and asked him if he'd be willing to help me do some research on finding out what was the story on alien viruses, what were the evidences of that might be a problem. And so he helped me write a book. And that book we'll talk to in a minute, but I want to establish the thought in mind that we're talking about alien viruses. We're talking about the idea that there could be an epidemic caused by an invasion of aliens. Of course, in the classic case is H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, where most people think that that broadcast in 1938 actually caused a lot of panic. It turns out that if you look at the research, there was one guy ran a red light and one guy died of a heart attack, and that was it. That was in all of New Jersey. There was nobody else. And it was the media who basically described this as a panic. Now, the second example is one that's well known to people who've read Michael Crichton's book or seen the movie The Andromeda Strain, which is a story about how a satellite that we put up to study the upper atmosphere crashed early, and in that satellite there were some viruses which in fact began to kill people. And so we took an immediate action to study with the sophisticated facilities we had, deep underground facilities, that sort of thing, as to how we would prevent this epidemic from starting. And so these two stories basically reconfirm what has been the policy of the United States government ever since, and that is to avoid public panic at any cost. Whether or not it's a panic caused by an epidemic, caused by a financial collapse, caused by the religions going out of being overturned, but avoiding panic was the policy. Now, as far as viruses are concerned, there's lots of different ways that we Homo sapiens have used to try to kill each other with viruses, and one of them, of course, is catapulting corpses in the Middle Ages. And then smallpox we gave to the Indians with blankets. And we had the Japanese had an evil program that was infecting Chinese in the 32 to 45. British are testing anthrax on the sheep, and I'm pretty sure Nick Pope would be able to confirm that. But anthrax accident in Sverdlovsk, that was a Soviet problem where one anthrax escaped and caused a little problem. And then one of the experts at the Soviet facility studying viruses was Biopreprat. He defected to the United States right after the Cold War ended and came to work at our facility studying biological warfare, which is Fort Detrick. Now, many of you don't know that there are 4 pathogens for human. Pathogens generally is kind of a small thing that causes you to die or gives you some sickness. And the first one, the biggest one, is fungi, of course, and that's an example would be athlete's foot. They're rarely fatal. Bacteria are about 10 times smaller, and these are listed in order of decreasing size. And pneumonia would be an example of that. And then Ebola would be an example of a virus. And then finally, even smaller than viruses are prions, proteinaceous infectious particles that cause mad cow disease. And all of these have been studied by the biological warfare facilities that the larger countries have had, which includes the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and the United States, and maybe others. So now, today, I want to take the examples. There were about 28 examples in the book that we wrote called Alien Viruses, MJ12, Crashed Saucers and Biological Warfare. I'll take just 3 examples and then a couple of other cases where there's some relationship to viruses. And these are the 3, the Roswell, Chihuahua, Cherez, and Varginha. And then the Kingman crash, and then a little bit on Andromeda fact or fiction. So now as I've said, I had wound up with having 100 or so different documents, one of which was called the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit Memo. It was printed in the early 40s. And as far as I'm concerned, the documents that I'm showing today are clearly authentic in my mind. There are some people who still claim that we can't prove that, but what they say is consistent between 2 of them. It shows that you can read it yourself, but basically it says that there's 3 technicians died immediately, and the status of the 4th technician was unknown. Another leaked document from the first annual report in 1951 describes this in more detail, but again, it says all 4 later died of seizures and profuse bleeding. So there's an example where, in fact, clearly the virus, there's a pathogen from an alien, which were being handled by our personnel with biosuits, that they caused 4 people to die. The second one was interesting in the Chihuahua crash, and in August 1974, a light plane and a UFO crashed, and we tracked with radar that it was going to Mexico. So it went south of Brownsville to a place called Chihuahua, and we sent our reconnaissance airplanes to look at it, and sure enough, they saw that it was on the ground. They saw that there were Mexican vehicles apparently trying to recover it, but everything was stopped, and we looked more carefully, and it turned out that the Mexicans were not moving. So we did send on our crash retrieval team, the same one that's described in Psalm 101, as to how you recover the craft, and they found that all the Mexicans were dead. So we recovered the craft carefully and trying to avoid getting exposed, and we flew it to Atlanta, presumably because that's where the Center for Disease Control was. And the third example, is of Argentina, Brazil. There was an alien, as I recall, it was the one that had particularly red eyes. But anyway, this alien was being taken by the military police to the hospital by this guy Cherez, and he was wound up touching the alien without his protective gloves, and then about a week and a half, 2 weeks later, he was dead. So there's the 3 specific examples of where we know that some sort of pathogen from the aliens have caused our people to die. So it can be a problem. Now, in addition, there have been a number of other cases where there have been some anomalies that we've seen that we can't explain, one of which was the Kingman crash in 1953, where there were multiple witnesses, and it turned out that we did find a craft that we could access with an entry crew, and they went in, they had biological protection, and after they came out, they threw up, and they couldn't remember what they saw inside, and they were ill for a while, but they didn't die. But this is another example of some sort of pathogen from an alien ship that caused us problems. So it is enough to worry about. Now, my son, Ryan, whom I mentioned had done these 7 crash retrieval conferences, wound up writing a book. And his book identified 74 different cases of crashes throughout the world at various quality levels. And he even confirmed some of these with remote viewing. But this is a superior book because it's the only one that exists, I think, that tries to systematically identify the different crashes that we've had. Now, there's a 5th example I want to mention, and that was, I said that Fort Detrick was the place where we do our own biological research, biological warfare research. And Nick Redfern, who was my colleague in writing this book, Alien Viruses, put out a request publicly to anybody who has any information about alien viruses, please let him know. So he got a call from somebody who said he used to work at Fort Detrick, and they got together, and the witness, whose name I don't know, basically told him this story. He said, when I was at Fort Detrick as kind of a security guard, there was a guy there who had written a story called Andromeda, Fact or Fiction. And it's a 194-page document. It was just kind of speculative on whether or not we did have a facility just like that, and it had been apparently circulated around the management there at Fort Detrick, and somehow it got to the CIA. And the CIA read it, and they returned it to Fort Detrick with a stamp that says Majestic 12-12-12 approved, spike back. Now, nobody's ever heard spike back as the code word for Majestic 12-12-12 before. But anyway, this is one example of where the Majestic program, which is I'll be talking about in a minute, actually had some interest in alien viruses. This is the book that I was mentioning, Alien Viruses, Crash Saucers, MJ-12, and Biowarfare. And the reason it's a page-turner is because it was mostly written by Nick Redfern, who is a great writer. And at the end of one chapter, he makes you want to turn to the next one. So I've got some copies out there at the vending table. So the question that Jan Harzan had originally asked me to deal with was, are alien viruses a problem for the future of humanity? And actually, there's a lot of assumptions you have to make in order to deal with the answer to that question. But one of them is maybe we already have all the bad viruses that ever existed, because it has been assumed that all the panspermia go everywhere. So all of the bad pathogens may have already been here, and that's why we don't have more. So that's one thought. And if that's true, then we've already been exposed to most of them, so it's not a problem. But I would say more specifically in the context of, do I think that aliens are going to come in and release a virus or other pathogen that would kill us intentionally, kill the whole population? I think the answer is no, for a couple of reasons. Number one, they could have done it. If they wanted to do it, they would have done it a long time ago. And number two is the vast majority of the multiple races that seem to be visiting us seem to not want to interfere with our society, and in general, except for a couple of evil ones, seem to be treating us kind of nicely. They want to learn more about our civilization, watch us grow. In some cases, maybe they want to help us develop. However, there is a case where I think that we could actually get an epidemic attack from biological warfare, and that would be if some of our own people, such as the terrorists or maybe the cabal, decided that was a good thing to do. So I would worry about Homo sapiens more than I would worry about the aliens causing a virus. So that kind of answers the question associated with the alien viruses. Now, I want to talk about a new leaked document. And when I say new, it's new in the sense that, as far as I know, I'm the only person who has come out and has taken a position that might have some merit. This document was released by Heather Wade a year ago in June, and it was basically 47 pages from the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and it's a Project Aquarius document. Now, there was an earlier Project Aquarius document from 1985 that Bill Moore had released that is relatable, but this was brand new, and it was widely regarded by people in the field who I respect, like Linda Moulton Howe and Nick Redfern. Both said, hey, this is a fake, and here's why. And so I'll tell you why they're wrong about why they said it's a fake. But the reason that this might relate to alien viruses is this long sentence taken directly from the document. Well, I'm sorry, no, that's not quite right. This is a summary of how the document came. And as you can read the words, but I'll just highlight the idea that apparently the original source of this document was a copy of a microfilm taken by somebody who worked in the DIA and had access to it. And he showed it to his daughter and another military friend. The guy died, and his daughter and the other military friend showed it to another person, and the three of them decided that they needed to get this document out because it was the truth, and that the public should know. So they sent it onward. And Heather Wade, who used to be involved with the Art Bell Show, decided on her own to release it immediately. So she did that. And of course, these days when you get anything over the internet, the first assumption you make is it must be phony. But the second assumption, of course, you can explore is that true? So that's what I'm doing here. But I'm honoring Heather Wade's request to make sure that she gets the credit for being the first person to release this. Now, the reason I mention this especially is because as you go deep into the document, you'll find that the third portion of it, which I'll summarize in just a moment, is about a crash at Aztec. And some of you longtime UFO researchers may remember the Aztec crash in 1948. But basically what it said was that there was a yellowish dust that was found, and this dust was a disinfectant that was automatically discharged from the craft upon landing. So apparently the aliens were wanting to make sure they didn't infect us, which is very thoughtful of them, by putting out this dust, or maybe they used it for themselves too. But anyhow, it included potassium, chlorine, sulfur, and iodine. And I don't know whether today we know how to make it or not. If we do, it's certainly not in the pharmaceutical world. So the obvious question is it authentic? How many errors were there in it? In fact, you read it and it looks like the person couldn't really spell very well. And so many people said, well, that shows that basically you have some incompetent people doing this. They probably are, in fact, making it up. But the question is, what might we learn from it? And this document was really very illegible. In fact, here it is. There's 47 pages here. But if you turn to any one of these pages, it turns out you really need a magnifying glass to read the words. And by the time you take out a magnifying glass and struggle through the words, you really are not interested. You're not really reading it for enjoyment. You're reading it just to figure out what it says. So I decided the thing to do is to retype it. So every letter, every space on every line was exactly the same as it was before it was put on microfilm and then copied. And so having done that, then I'd like to begin this discussion of asking, what does it say? As opposed to, is it authentic? The first, it's been 5 parts. The first part is the objectives, the history, and the organization of the Majestic 12 program. And this document, by the way, is dated 1989, January 1st. So that's as of 1989. The second part is the historical precedents at Roswell, New Mexico. What they do is they identify a lot of specific details that have never been published, to my knowledge, about the Roswell crash and who was in charge and who did what and what they got. And then the historical precedents at, Aztec, New Mexico. At Aztec, where it was 8 months later, in March 48, that we recovered a craft there, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what it said there. And then the fourth, at the Aztec crash, there were a number of extraterrestrial biological entities, or EBEs, some old, some younger, that were stored in cryogenic containers. And after we figured out how to open them up and get them unthawed, so to speak, one of them, EBE, we were talking to, turned out he understood English, and he was very happy to talk to us. So he was interviewed for 11 months in a cabin in Vermont, and after that he was returned to his civilization. But the fourth part is what he said and what we asked him. And then finally, the last part of this is the assessment of the situation and what MJ12 thought was the present position, and should we worry, as of 1989. Okay, so now we're going to go through these one at a time. The example here is I happened to be at the Lyndon Johnson Library archives a couple of weeks ago, and while I was there, I got access to some microfilm copies, and this is one on the left here that you're looking at, is a microfilm copy from 1949, and that you can see is not very legible. And the one on the right is the microfilm copy that we're looking at now from one of the pages. And the reason I show this is to show that, well, they're roughly the same legibility from copy of a microfilm. And the one on the left is a pica type. The one on the right is elite type. But otherwise, they're kind of similar. So we'll go to what did it say in detail. The first one was the objectives of the program. It said that MJ-12 was trying to evaluate the risk, control, and containment of U.S. airspace by the aliens. That advanced beings were continually detected, and we had 7 craft, 27 beings since 1947. 3 of those craft were intact and 1 was still working. So this is their statement in 1989. And the whole document was prepared for briefing to 1 person. It said this is an entry-level briefing, and there was only 1 copy of it. It was to be destroyed after briefing. Well, they didn't destroy it, obviously, but in any case, that's what we have. So that's the objectives. After the objectives in the first part was the history, where they said it was the DIA, counterintelligence, had it on microfilm. And they talked about the craft stories at Flat Rock, Nevada. I'll come to that in a moment. And there was a 12-person directorate chosen for life, which is the same as everybody already knows from the Eisenhower briefing document. And the vacancies were filled by unanimous vote, and it was a small family of experts. Now, the organization chart was there too, and it said the president is the 13th member of this MJ-12, and that there's some task units and some enforcement of it, and there's actually an organization chart I'll show you in a second. But in addition, there are plainclothes operatives, men in black, spreading cover stories and controlling the public interest in them. I presume that some of them might be here today, making sure that they do the right thing, for whatever that is. This is the organization chart that's actually in the document you'd be able to get at the vendor table, all 34 pages of the 47. And because you can't read that, I've created one you can read, which shows that the president is in charge. Then there's the directorate, and then you have 4 different task forces, an astronomy one, an analytical one, a linguistics one, and a sightings one. So they had their own sightings report. The enforcements were done at Digger Command, which is at Flat Rock, Nevada. And the Blue Berets and Air Cavalry are the military enforcement, following the procedures in this Psalm 101. That doesn't say that in the document, but it's just my observation. And then finally, it shows the interactions, covert interactions with the other intelligence agencies, the NSC, the CIA, the FBI, the Air Force Office of Scientific Intelligence, and the Office of Naval Intelligence there on the right. And it also identifies the different classification levels in each one of the military organizations on another page. I didn't reproduce that page. So that's the first part. The second part is Roswell, and it shows that the facts are consistent with lots of books have been written. It reaffirms the weather balloon cover story. It says there's 327 fragmented pieces that were recovered. They were aluminum, silicon, zirconium, and metal. And that they were flexible, unaffected by cutting torches, and that they also had bios of the 12, the mini bios, I call them, of the 12 MJ-12 directors that were just more extensive than the ones that were shown in the Eisenhower briefing document. Now, the Aztec crash was initially, about a year later after the crash, was widely described in this book, Behind the Flying Saucers, written by Frank Scully. Now, it turned out Scully was the kind of reporter who liked to write weird things, but the people he talked to were the people who were associates of the owner of the land where the Aztec vehicle crashed. And so he got some real data from the original crash retrieval that was correct. The diameter of the craft and a lot of other things. It was in the book, but it turned out because the people who were involved were sort of mysterious. He talked about Dr. G, and didn't say who he really was. And when they did find that somebody who was involved had a record, it turned out he had sort of a checkered record, having been involved with problems with law enforcement in the past. So it turned out that this book was widely discredited by the UFO community and the public, in spite of the fact that it was a real story of what went on in the Aztec crash. So that's kind of a fun thing in the context of the history of our organization. So the Aztec crash was in March 1948. And General Marshall contacted the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, for which, as I said, we have a leaked document for. It was a fairly accurate story, but the public concluded it was a fake. And they said, and that saved us a lot of energy, so we didn't have to put our men in black on making it sure that it didn't get out. And there were 6 scientists that were added, and this was the first time some of these scientists' names have been shown in association with UFO crash recovery. Besides Highland, von Neumann, Oppenheimer, von Ressler, Tuvey, there was a guy by the name of Van Valkenburg. And Van Valkenburg presumably was a professor at the University of Colorado, where I attended, and he left in 1951, and he would have been there when I was at Colorado. I didn't remember his name, but I did, I'll talk to that more later, but I did talk to my brother and sister, who were a little younger than I was, and they knew of this guy's name. He was a sort of family name in Boulder. So the Aztec crash is very interesting because the craft had a little crack in it, and they had to use blowtorches, I guess, to open this crack and pry it apart. They finally did get in, and I mentioned the yellowish dust was determined to be a disinfectant, but there were 12 aliens in a preservation mode, and it was cryogenic, I think, and 1 Earth-like adult recovered. There were several that lost their lives in the process of recovery, but several that did not. And Truman gave diplomatic status to him for the interviews that I mentioned that lasted for 11 months. And then he was returned in August 49 to a UFO who took him away, according to this document. The one thing that I didn't reprint was the photographic icons at the back, pictographic icons. These were apparently from the craft. The upper left there was presumably it's what their control panel showed, and then the right-hand side are some of the words associated with their communication. It would be interesting to compare those with some of the icons that were on the Roswell craft that have been presented before. So here's a simulation of the Aztec crash. It shows the vehicle in the lower left, and this is the right geometry for where it really happened. Now, as I say, the fourth part of this is a summary of the condensed conversations that occurred. There were 11 months of interviews, and apparently Truman himself was involved in some of these interviews, and there were 683 pages worth of records of these interviews, of which 7 pages are summarized in this document. And so we asked, well, why did you come? And his answer was to bring you these children, and we like trees. And then he went on to point out that it's easy to grow children, but it's hard to grow trees. So there's a lot of interesting philosophical remarks made by this EBE in the document, one of which I thought really impressed me. I'll come to it at the bottom line, the quote here: "The searching for truth is our greatest social challenge and purpose." But the one thing he said that was really exciting to me is that he said that the reason that they came is because in 1999, Tesla sent a signal that traveled at instantaneously, apparently not limited by the speed of light, throughout the universe by harnessing the magnetic field of the Earth somehow. And that signal upset their planet's geology and weather and maybe their ozone layer, and they sent us a signal back, but we couldn't understand it. They did send a craft back which interviewed Marconi, apparently in 1922, but this was the group that was returning in response to the original signal. Anyway, he went on to say that they had very long lives, that if you go to the Isle of Pines now, which is near New Zealand in the South Pacific, you'll find that there is some mortar that's been poured as a launch pad. He claimed that it was poured by his grandfather, that they had long lifespans. But I like the quote so much that I found another quote here. There are two classic quotes. Our God is change and our religion is understanding. Searching for truth is our greatest social challenge and purpose. And actually that rang true with me, because my goal to be here talking with you, MUFON, is to find the truth. I want to find the truth about what's going on. I don't care about the detail of whether or not it should or should not have been released in a classified document. If it's the truth, it's the truth. In my judgment, mankind will get over these limitations that we have of having governments. Look, think of Nick Pope's kind of view. In 2045, we're going to have a different world, and that world, in my judgment, will be based on truth. So I'm aiming for the truth. The other thing I thought about that was the emphasis of our God is change and our religion's understanding. There was, in fact, a contactee in the 50s whose name was Dan Fry, and perhaps some of you remember that he set up a group called Understanding. Whether or not that was from the same interaction with this particular society or not is not clear. Incidentally, this particular EBE did come from Zeta Reticuli system, and that was interesting. So it was the Betty and Barney Hill group. The second quote is, knowledge is only good when spread like seeds from which wisdom may grow, and faith has purpose only when it is not created of fear. That's why I think religions that don't depend on fear are so helpful. And then finally, the last part is that the assessment of MJ12 was that they agreed with him that Tesla triggered the alien visitors in 1899. That was right in our documents. Said, yeah, he did it. And it disturbed their geology, weather, and ozone, as they said, that they had cultural exchanges during the 70s and 80s. And then this document goes on to describe 4 types of EBE, but not 54. And they said that their particular motherships come here every 22 years for the solar system, and then they're replaced. And the way they work is they are powered by balancing gravity wave against the electromagnetic wave, generating a third kind of wave. So I asked my acquaintance, well, I didn't ask him. My acquaintance whom I was talking with at the time was Hal Putoff, and he said, yeah, how do they do that? So that's where we'd like to go, is figure out how that really works, and presumably that's what the ATIP program might reveal, who knows. So anyway, the position goes on to say, diplomatically, there was full and complete diplomatic status given to this particular group. Eisenhower, that's DDE, Dwight David Eisenhower, signed an agreement with him in July 54, and that included in that agreement these 3 quotes: a listing of all persons that are contacted or removed, abductions had to be less than 48 hours, and they avoided willful contact with the news media. Well, it turned out they didn't honor those restrictions at all. And in addition, it's not in this document, but I've been reasonably convinced that there were other treaties that were signed with other races by Eisenhower that may have also been violated. This document said there was a headquarters base in Nevada for use by the EBEs. Okay, now, remember I said that I keystroked every single letter on every single line. And if you want to find out, if you ever have to copy a document, what you want to do is the last letter of the last word in each line and see whether it lines up with the previous line or not. And if it doesn't line up, then there's some errors. So that way you'll find, for instance, if the typist has added an extra space or has forgotten to add a space, you'll find the errors. And here are the errors that sort of summarized in a gross way. There are 21 times the wrong word was used, and this is a simple example. Form should be from. The second example was there were 2 typists, and the reason I know that is because in the first parts, A and B, there were 3 there were 3 spaces when you're starting a new paragraph, and the second typist, there were 4 spaces. So once you get in the habit of doing it that way, you always do it. So that way you know there were 2 typists involved. And one of the typists had a problem of knowing the difference between ITS and IT apostrophe S. They made a lot of apostrophe S's when it should have been just ITS. And there were some mixed spelled words. The explanation, for example, was an example. And the hyphen sometimes was missing. Commas were sometimes there or not there. Sometimes upper or lowercase were incorrect. And sometimes the spacing was wrong. In general, there were total of 80 errors made by 2 typists. And as you're doing this, when I was typing it, it had the 509th. And so I typed 509th, and it made the th as a superscript on my Dell computer. And so I had to force it to be not a superscript. And so one of the things, if this was a fake document using current technology, it would have automatically gone to uppercase TH, and the faker might not have noticed that. But anyway, it's a minor point. But so the minor points, these are the points that came up immediately as to why they thought it was a hoax. And I'll come to the major points in just a moment, but I think these are minor points. One of the experts in the security classification looked it over and said, this is absolutely not consistent with the way our government now says things should be classified. And for example, it should have been top secret ultra instead of ultra top secret. And you wouldn't use, other people said you wouldn't use the word compartmentalized, and nobody heard of blue berets or air cavalry and flat rock, not well known. Well, flat rock, it turned out, was the name that was used in Andromeda strain as the facility in this fictional novel in 1969. So the question is, does the fact that somebody sucked this name out of a fictional novel and called it Flat Rock, does that mean that it's clearly a hoax? Or does that mean that MJ12 decided to use that great novel as a basis for what they would call their high security spot? Who knows? Other examples of why minor points for a hoax, reptilians were not mentioned. I think that's very important because I think the presence of the reptilians are critical. And then the Eisenhower briefing document, or EBD, says that in the 6th of December 1950, a second object crashed. But if you heard that I said it was only 8 months after Roswell that Aztec crashed, that would be inconsistent. So the question is, why would you not have the correct information in this document? Well, one example would be that the people who were creating the Eisenhower briefing document on the assumption that what they were doing was creating something for the president, the incoming president, basically get sort of a briefing about here's what's going on with MJ12, just a kind of a short few-page briefing rather than the whole thing. They might have felt that the Aztec crash, where we had this alien come talk to us for 11 months, that was too unbelievable, and they decided to leave that out rather than put it in. So that leads me to another thought, and that is, as you read a document like this, you have to ask yourself, well, who was writing it, if it's authentic? Who was writing it, and why were they writing it? And did they necessarily say everything that they knew? And was everything that they said truthful? They might have been putting some non-truths in there. So, but the major points for a hoax that really started to worry me is how come it didn't say there were any crashes before 47? You know, we had Cape Girardeau crash of 1941. We had the Battle of LA with 2 crashes. The Navy got one at sea, and then we got one from the San Bernardino Mountains. The Army got that. And then there was the San Antonio crash of 1945. And it said there were no crashes after 57, and Kicksburg occurred after 57, and that probably was a regular crash too. And you can't find this guy Van Valkenburg with 30 patents, metal alloy processes, and would so many errors be okay? And then finally, the one that I think that turned off most of the people as they read the 7 pages of summary of interacting with an alien conversation in such with such a subtle knowledge of our society. In other words, he used Santa Claus, for example, as one of his points in his arguments. So I think most people who felt it was not true were turned off strongly by the detailed knowledge that this alien must have had of our society that seemed way too sophisticated. However, the provenance is really credible, in my opinion. Here's a case of somebody died, gave it to their daughter. And there's no particular reason to feel that might not have happened. It was typed on a typewriter, and we do know it seems like consistent with being a photocopy. There were two typists. Seems unlikely to be a hoax document. The Roswell details are right. Aztec details are fantastic and new. And Van Valkenburg's 30 patents may be found. And I would argue the Flat Rock location argues for authenticity. That is, what better thing to do if you're MJ12 than to decide, hey, what do we name this facility we've got that's underground that we're using for storing our craft and giving the aliens a base for? Let's call it Flat Rock, because that's what was in Crichton's novel. So, in addition, both MJ12 and EBE emphasize Tesla's role, and I think that's quite important because I believe that many people who've been studying what Tesla had done for us and what might have done and how far he got to really understanding the subtleties of gravity control are fascinating. There was a question that was asked that I can't answer, that is, what is the error rate that you would expect in a genuine top secret document? There's no way that I know to get that. Actually, that's the one thing that Louis Alessandro might be able to do, is to take a genuine top secret document and figure out what the error rate is. Because see if we can compare that, and that what I'm seeing is like two errors per page is sort of credible. So this third point is an example that I already gave, namely they might not have wanted a new person to, well, no, I didn't give this example. They might not have wanted a new person to see the different multiple races. And then the fourth point I already made is that Eisenhower briefing document didn't discuss eyesight because maybe they thought that it was too way out for him to be exposed to right then. Well, one of the things that was interesting to me was this guy, Van Valkenburg. It was particularly interesting because it was my school, and I talked to my brother, actually just about a month ago, and he said, yeah, he says, I remember a guy by the name of Van Valkenburg. I think that our father used to go to the Rotary Club where he was a member. So I said, oh, really? So they later did a little research, and I went to the library at University of Colorado and found in their archives that indeed there was a Van Valkenburg, spelled B-U-R-G-H, not B-E-R-G, who was a professor and retired in 1951, just like it said. So anyway, my sister gave me a phone number for a Van Valkenburg who lived in Colorado, so I picked him up with the phone and said, hi, I'm doing some research on a document. And we talked, and it turned out that his grandfather was the guy, and that this Van Valkenburg family had Van Valkenburg II, Van Valkenburg III, and Van Valkenburg IV. Van Valkenburg II, who was the guy who allegedly was at the Aztec crash, was an engineer, of course, and he wanted his son, Van Valkenburg III, to be an engineer, but he didn't want to be an engineer. He turned out being a patent attorney. So as a patent attorney, then his son was Van Valkenburg IV, whom I talked to on the phone. And he told me this. I asked him, well, where did your grandfather go when he retired in 51? He said, I think he moved to Arizona. Well, it turned out that the document that I have says that this Van Valkenburg was the owner of 30 patents through Arizona State University. that were based on metal alloys, and that he was an expert in this field, and that specifically he made these patents because of what he learned in the process of dissecting the information and materials from the Aztec crash. So I'm working on the process of trying to establish that the patents were in the name of Van Valkenburg the second, and as I think that would be a superior link in potentially authenticating this document. So the question is, what's next for me? Well, some of you may know that I was lucky enough to meet a guy by the name of Bill Tompkins, who had been in the Navy, and he's written a book which is very successful called Selected by Extraterrestrials. He told the story of what he learned during that time, and I'll mention that in a moment. And the second thing I want to do is to deal with the Aquarius authenticity, that is both this document and the Bill Moore document that he had in 1985 that presumably was released as a result of his interaction with Air Force Office of Scientific Intelligence, which might have been a plan to see what the reaction of the UFO community was to seeing an authentic document, or maybe a fake one. So that's basically one of the things I'd like to do, but mainly I want to get focused on publishing Bill Tompkins' book 2. And the reason for that is because and I talked about this at a symposium last year, but this guy, Bill Tompkins, was a smart kid whose uncle took him to the station in Seal Beach in California, and he would look at the Navy ships where the guns were, where the radar emplacements were, and he would make model sculptures of these ships that got shown in the department store. And the Navy looked at this ship models and decided they were classified secret. And so they went to try to arrest him, and they found out he was just a smart kid. Well, when he turned to be 17, I think they stretched it a little bit, Bill got encouraged to join the Navy. And the first thing that they did was to ask him, after basic training, to sit in on some briefings that the Admiral was receiving regularly. This is 1942, from spies, actually up to 29 spies who had been in Nazi Germany, telling about what the Germans were doing. And that was his first assignment. Then after he did that for 3 years, where he was the courier to take these data around, he wound up going to work for Douglas Aircraft Company, where I worked. And he worked in a think tank at the same time that I was there, not in a think tank, just as a fresh kid out of college. And so he, at that time, he tells me that in 1954, he was working for one of the same vice presidents I was working for, but they were working on a Navy contract on UFO design. And he, in fact, was the graphical artist who drew the sketch for Solar Warden, which is, as you may know, a claimed Navy vehicle that has been around for a long time that we developed. Then he went to work for TRW, and the story of Selected by Extraterrestrials that I wrote, his autobiography, ends at 1970, but it doesn't say much about the subtleties of what he did at TRW or anything he did from 1970 to now. He died last fall. And so he was an amazing man. When he was at TRW, he had the opportunity to have the briefing level that he could see Neil Armstrong landing on the moon live. And in the process of seeing that, he was able to see that there were 6 vehicles, 6 alien craft on the rim of the crater. And the sketch that he made is in the book. He also told me something that will be in book 2, namely that in his judgment, the Navy was so far ahead that the first satellite that went into orbit was actually a Navy submarine, that they took the nuclear stuff out and they put in the anti-gravity unit and took off from Newport News directly to space. So that's kind of exciting and almost unbelievable, but he knows that there is a secret space program, and I've met with his friends, and last year if some of you were here last year, you heard my talk on that subject of the secret space program in the context of how do they keep it secret. And the thing that I've concluded is that the secrecy level in this country and in the world is vastly more than anybody in this room could ever have imagined, except for a few who know. The authenticity of the 1985 Aquarius documents is established here to the extent that I'm showing you a photograph, or actually a scan, of the 11 35 millimeter films that I got from Bill Moore. Because after Bill Moore did his thing with UFO world, he got so upset he left. He allegedly was more interested in the Mormon church. And so I called him up. I said, Bill, you got some files? And he said, yeah. I said, what would it take for me to get all your files? And he told me. So I gave him what it took. And I wound up with all his files, and included in the files were these 11 35 millimeter film copies. And actually, all these files have been gone over, and Nick Redfern, among others, has taken a whole week to go through every single folder in the files to see whether Bill Moore had any other interesting stuff. And there's nothing really worth getting excited about besides these. Okay, the book Aquarius, Aquarius is the code name for the Majestic 12 document, the 47 pages that we talked about, and I've retyped 33 of these pages, and they're available at the vendor table. And if you're a little skeptical and conclude that there's no evidence that these are authentic, that's fine. But I assure you that if you read these pages, you'll find that they're very entertaining, that they're very creative, and that they're very exciting, especially if you think they really might be true. So my goal is to get the truth, and that concludes my presentation. I want to go to the truth, and I'll take questions and answers.